All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. This is James Saucedo on the field team at NLIHC, and this is our monthly United for Homes endorser webinar. So we've got a lot to talk about this afternoon, given the tax bill that was introduced in the U.S. House just last week, and we thank you all for joining us. A couple of reminders before we get started. Today's presentation is being recorded, and everyone will get a follow-up message tomorrow with a link to view and share the recording with folks in your network. We'll also have a follow-up message that will include some follow-up resources and materials for you to make use of in your advocacy efforts that we hope you'll join us in. And also, the webinar will be open to any questions that you have at the end of the presentation, which you can type into the chat box on the webinar platform, and we'll address all of those at the end of the presentation. So now I'm going to pass it over to Sarah Michelson, our Policy Director, who will lead us in the presentation today.
Great. Thank you so much. As James mentioned, we are really in the throes of tax reform right now. So I was hoping I could talk to you about some of the changes that are in the House bill and how we as housing advocates can have an impact on what's included in any final bill. First, I wanted to just recap a little bit about what United for Homes is all about and what our campaign is really aimed towards. So as many of you know from the work that you guys do on the ground, there is a severe shortage of affordable and available rental housing for people who have the greatest needs or people who have the lowest incomes. And what we've found through our research is that there's more than a 7.2 million unit shortage of affordable homes for people who are extremely low income, and another 500,000 people who have no homes at all. And so throughout all of the work that we do, we are looking towards how we can best increase resources that are targeted to serve this population, whether it's through the regular appropriations bills that Congress works on each year, through HUD and USDA rural housing, or through the tax code and through tax reform. Unfortunately, all of the resources that we advocate for at HUD and USDA are really just a quarter of all of the federal dollars that Congress spends each year on housing. And we think through modest reforms, we can generate more savings that could be going towards where the greatest needs are. Here I wanted to just recap where we are in terms of housing needs across the country. You'll see that there is no state where there's an adequate supply of housing for people who have the lowest incomes. It's of course worse on the coastal areas, but even the best state, the state with the most available homes for people who are extremely low income, still runs in North Dakota about 64 homes for every 100 households. So because there aren't available and affordable housing units on the market, these folks really have no choice but to spend more than 50% of their income often on housing. That leaves very few resources left over for everything else that people need to survive: transportation, child care, health care costs, etc. But as I mentioned, the resources that we fight for are really just a small piece of the puzzle of how the federal government addresses the housing needs of Americans. So you'll see here that the amount of money that we spend through the mortgage interest deduction, which is a tax break that homeowners can take based on the size of their mortgage and the interest that they pay on their mortgage, that far exceeds the amount of resources that we spend at HUD and USDA on people who have the very, very lowest incomes. Here you can see how the mortgage interest deduction plays out in terms of incomes. And you can see that even though some people who have modest incomes receive the mortgage interest deduction, the bulk of the resources really go to people who have the very highest incomes, people who would have a stable home regardless of whether or not they received a tax break for it, and people who would very likely become homeowners anyways without this incentive. And so our solution has been from the beginning to make some modest changes to the mortgage interest deduction so that it can better serve low and moderate income homeowners, but also generate significant savings that we can reinvest into housing solutions that serve people who have the very lowest incomes through items like the National Housing Trust Fund, a renter's tax credit, or other resources. So we've proposed 3 changes to current law. The first would be to lower the size of a mortgage that is eligible for the tax break from the current standard, which is up to $1 million, to the first $500,000 of a mortgage. That impacts fewer than 6% of mortgages nationally and would produce about $95 billion in savings that we could be reinvesting into affordable rental housing. The second reform is to convert the mortgage interest deduction into a credit. So one of the biggest problems with the mortgage interest deduction is that half of all homeowners don't receive any benefit through the mortgage interest deduction, and that's because they don't itemize their tax deductions. Instead, they take the standard deduction. But that means that many low and moderate income homeowners are cut off from this biggest source of housing subsidy that the federal government spends. So by turning it into a credit, we've estimated that 25 million homeowners would see a greater tax break than they do currently, and that includes 15 million low and moderate income homeowners who currently receive $0 through the mortgage interest deduction. And then our last reform is to take the savings that are generated from those two reforms, that's $241 billion over 10 years, and to reinvest it to where the needs are the greatest, to people who are either experiencing homelessness or people whose incomes are extremely low. I did want to just spend a quick moment to look at where those mortgages above $500,000 are located. You can see that for the vast majority of the country, very few homes are above $500,000. You can see less than 1% in many places, less than 2% or 3%. There are only a handful of communities where there are, a sizable number of mortgages that are above $500,000. The interesting thing is that the Republican tax bill that was released last week did take some historic steps towards reining in the mortgage interest deduction. But ultimately, and we can go into those in more detail, ultimately the bill is not something that we can support. It's irresponsible and it's unacceptable as it currently is. And in large part, that has to do with the fact that while they make changes to the mortgage interest deduction, they really just recycle those savings back to the highest income earners through tax breaks like repealing the estate tax and lowering the corporate tax rate from 35% to 20%. It's also problematic outside of the issues around the mortgage interest deduction for eliminating and undermining many affordable housing production tools that are out there. We think that will increase the severity of the affordable rental housing crisis, and we're really worried about that. But we're also worried about the long-term effects of running such high deficit numbers. We'll go into this in more detail. But the effect that would have on future investments in affordable housing through HUD and USDA. So first I want to talk about the changes to the mortgage interest deduction that are in the Republican House bill. The first change is a more indirect change to the mortgage interest deduction. So the tax bill would double or nearly double the size of the standard tax deduction that people can take. And doing so, more people would be choosing to take the standard deduction rather than itemizing their taxes. And so just in terms of people deciding what to do in order to get the greatest tax break, fewer people would be taking the mortgage interest deduction, more people would be taking the standard deduction, they'd be getting more of a tax break through that angle. That means that instead of 30% of tax filers still itemizing, we'd see that number shrink to about 5% or so, 5 or 6%. In a way, that means that the mortgage interest deduction would actually become even more regressive than it already is, which is hard to believe because it's so regressive as it currently stands, which is why we were really pleased to see that the Republican bill helps rein in some of that excess by reducing the size of a mortgage that's eligible from $1 million to the first $500,000 on new home purchases. So that's an important piece too. This would not impact current homeowners and their ability to take the mortgage interest deduction. It would only come into play into new home purchases after the tax bill is passed. But despite the fact that they make some really important and reasonable changes to the mortgage interest deduction, the bill itself really doesn't achieve what we want it to, because it just takes those savings from those two reforms and channels it right back to the very same people who would be getting a tax break by lowering tax rates for billionaires and corporations. So we did not see any new resources added to the National Housing Trust Fund or the creation of a renter's credit or rental assistance or any other targeted rental housing assistance. Instead, we saw the savings from these changes to the mortgage interest deduction be used to repeal the estate tax, which helps the very top 0.2% of earners in the country. It repealed the AMT tax, the alternative minimum tax for corporations, and also lower the corporate tax rates from 35% to 20%, which is a huge boon for some of the largest corporations in America. I also wanted to touch a little bit more in depth about some other changes that were included in the tax bill that impact affordable rental housing. We're really concerned to see that it eliminates private activity housing bonds, and therefore it essentially eliminates the 4% low-income housing tax credit. That's a resource that's being used more and more to provide affordable rental housing, and we estimate that that would lead to 80,000 fewer affordable rental homes being built. It also eliminates the new markets tax credit, the historic tax credit, which are also used in communities to rebuild and do revitalization work. Surprisingly, the bill did not include any of the bipartisan reforms that were in the T-Berry-Neal low-income housing tax credit bill. These are reforms that would have helped the low-income housing tax credit better reach people who have the very lowest incomes. It also was a bill that had over 100 co-sponsors in the House, so that's a real shock that none of the reforms in that bill were included in this tax proposal. And then finally, it would have the impact of reducing the value of the low-income housing tax credit by reducing corporate tax rates so deeply. And that would have a big impact on the ability to garner or to generate equity that could be invested into affordable housing developments. The other thing I wanted to spend a little bit of time on is the impact on affordable housing programs in the future. So one of the things that Republicans are looking to do with this bill, or what's allowing them to move forward with this bill, is instructions that they've been given to let them spend or increase the debt, rather, by $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. That's what's allowing them to cut so many taxes for the highest income earners. Our fear with this is not only is it irresponsible to be increasing the debt in this way, but from a political perspective, we're worried that in future years we're going to see the same Republicans who passed this tax bill start calling for really deep spending cuts to either entitlement programs that help people achieve some of the basic needs that they need in life, or we'll see even deeper cuts to housing programs and other programs on the domestic side. We've already seen this play out. Many of you have seen this play out in recent years. If you remember, in 2011, Congress passed the law trying to get at reining in some of our debt and deficits. And as a result, we've seen low spending caps on both defense programs and non-defense programs, which includes the affordable housing and community development programs at HUD and USDA. And each year since then, it's been a real struggle for advocates to just maintain current levels of funding and program service at HUD. So we're looking down the road and seeing this $1.5 trillion in debt as being even more pressure that will be on Congress to cut really important programs that we use in our communities. So from our perspective, we really think that this House bill is a non-starter. We want to see the Senate bill improve upon a lot of these really negative things are included. At the top of our list, though, is making sure that if there are reforms to the mortgage interest deduction, which we think that there should be, that the savings from that goes into helping to end homelessness and housing poverty and not be recycled back to the very highest income earners and corporations. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of timeline of what does this mean. Right now, Republicans in Congress are moving forward with lightning speed on this. Their hope is to get this done as soon as possible, and definitely their goal is to get it through before the recess for Thanksgiving. That recess actually starts next Friday. So that means Republicans really have the rest of this week and next week to try to move as quickly as possible to get it through the House and Senate and onto the President's desk. This week, right now, the House Ways and Means Committee is debating the bill and offering amendments. We expect that to be completed today or tomorrow. At that time, we've heard that there will be no amendments added to the bill on the floor. That, again, points to how expedited this process is becoming, and they'll send it to the Senate. The Senate, on the other hand, is likely to release their bill as soon as tomorrow, possibly over the weekend, and they'll move it to the Senate floor as well. What makes the tax bill so threatening or so interesting to watch, I guess depends on your perspective, is that they really only need 50 votes to get this bill through because they're going through an expedited process called reconciliation. So that lets them pass this bill with only 50 votes in the Senate as opposed to the 60 votes that we're usually seeing when it comes to appropriations bills. In a way, that means it's easier for Republicans because they don't need to negotiate with Democrats to get any of their votes. On the other hand, it makes it more difficult because their entire caucus has to really stay together and be on the same page. Other people might disagree with me, but I actually think that there's a really good likelihood that they'll get this bill passed. We've seen very little criticism of the bill in the House from members of Congress, Republicans who might have grievances with the bill. They've largely dealt with those grievances behind the scenes. Again, we haven't heard much criticism from senators on the bill. So I think that all points to the fact that they have done a good job so far of staying together as a caucus and that they might be able to do that in the future. So given the really short timeline, we wanted to put on your radar who would be the best targets for you to reach out to if you live in these states or work in these states. And from our perspective, we have two different categories of people where you'd want to focus in terms of pushing for reinvestment of savings from the mortgage interest deduction. At the top of our list are moderate Republicans who Republican leaders in the Senate will need a court in order to get their vote. So that means Heller in Nevada, Susan Collins in Maine, Murkowski in Alaska, and Senator Hatch in Utah. Senator Hatch is the chairman of the Finance Committee, so he's in a special category because he has so much sway over what the final bill will look like. Our other targets are vulnerable Democrats in states that were won by Trump or that have a really large red conservative population in it. So those are Manchin from West Virginia, Donnelly from Indiana, Tester from Montana, Heitkamp from North Dakota, Nelson from Florida, McCaskill from Missouri, and Sherrod Brown from Ohio. The other thing that all of these folks have in common is that they are up for re-election in 2018. And while I think that many of them will stick with Democrats and ultimately vote against the final bill, there is a distinct possibility that some of them will cross the party line to vote on the tax bill. So I wanted to talk a little bit also about things that you can be doing in addition to reaching out to those moderate Dems and Republicans, and we'll get into a little bit more about how you can engage Democrats who weren't on the list. But the first thing that you can do to help us is to sign this national petition that we're circulating that really tells Congress that we need to keep housing dollars in housing. Instead of siphoning off housing dollars to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy, we need to see that those dollars reinvested in the forms of the National Housing Trust Fund or a renter's tax credit or other housing solutions. So there's a link there that you can follow and share with your friends. The other thing that we need your help on is helping to keep Senate Democrats and House Democrats on message. There's a lot in this tax bill to criticize, but we want to make sure that when they're doing that, they don't fall into the pattern of defending the mortgage interest deduction, which we know is highly regressive, goes to the very highest income earners, increases income inequality, and fuels the racial wealth gap. We want to make sure that they stay on message about the need to reinvest the dollars and not make claims about the mortgage interest deduction that aren't true. So we have sample talking points that you can use on that as well. And then I want to open it up to questions for you guys. There's so much on this bill that is confusing. There's a lot of elements at play, and I wanted to see if you guys have any questions for me or anyone else on our team here.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And a reminder to everyone on the presentation, on the webinar, that you can type your questions into the question box in the webinar platform, and we'll go ahead and talk through any that you have. Also, another reminder, today's presentation, as I mentioned at the top, is being recorded. Everyone will get a follow-up email with a link to view and share that recording, as well as all of the resources, including today's slides. So let's see. So as we wait for some questions to come in, Sarah, if I am coming from an organization, I personally or my organization has never taken action in federal advocacy, in particular on this issue. What should I do? How should I approach that? And how can I find contact information to reach my member of Congress?
Absolutely. Well, the more the merrier. If you haven't engaged your member of Congress on tax issues or on the mortgage interest deduction so far, now really is the time to do it because there's so much work being done behind the scenes to put together this bill. And Republicans have a really short, ambitious timeline for getting it done. So I want to encourage you all, if you haven't taken that step yet, to do so. Any help that you need figuring out who your members of Congress are or who the best staffer is for you to contact, you can feel free to reach out to us on that. We have contacts in every congressional office that we can put you in touch with. We have resources on the United for Homes website with fact sheets and other materials that you can be using, sample scripts, that you can be using when you're calling your congressional offices.
Great. Absolutely, and we will be sure to share contact information for Sarah and our organizers on the field team at the end of the presentation. But of course, as many of you already know, you're always welcome to reach out to anyone on our staff at any time. So here's a couple of questions that have just come in. Why should representatives or senators representing rural areas oppose the tax bill?
That's a good question. So there are a lot of things that are problematic in the bill that I went through before. One of them is that, again, those housing dollars that are generated from savings from changes to the mortgage interest deduction won't be going to benefit rural communities or low and moderate income people, regardless of where they live. Instead, they'll be going to the very highest income earners and corporations and not trickling down, if you will, to the people who need it the most. So we've proposed changes that would be much more of a direct resource to them. Reinvesting the money through the National Housing Trust Fund or through a renter's tax credit could be something that could reach all communities regardless of where they're located. The other concern with this bill, as I mentioned before, is the impact that it would have on the low-income housing tax credit and private activity bonds, but even more so, the impact it would have on future spending in rural areas through USDA's rural housing program and at HUD. Those deficit spending is going to be a really big issue. We've already seen the strain on USDA rural housing programs so far. There's been very little gains in that realm in terms of funding levels. Every year it's a tough fight just to maintain adequate funding or current funding levels at USDA. I will say that there are other issues that are really energizing more rural members of Congress if you happen to be located in California, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, or Texas. And that's something that we didn't touch upon today, but the elimination of the state and local tax deduction, which helps tax filers in those states. There are a number of Republicans who are in those areas who are also opposing that piece of the bill.
Great, thank you. Let's see, so a couple more questions are coming in. Let's see. Yep, okay, so let's see, sort of filtering through questions as they come in. So how would a renter's tax credit apply if a renter does not pay taxes?
Great idea. So we've been working with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities on a proposal for a renter's tax credit. The way that they have designed it is it would operate a lot like other programs that we have in terms of the Housing Trust Fund or Home Dollars. It would essentially, or the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit for that matter, it would provide resources that would be block granted to states that states could use to invest into affordable rental housing developments to make sure that rents are kept at an affordable rate. So it could be layered on top of the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, for example, to provide even deeper income targeting, or it could be used alongside the National Housing Trust Fund or outside of that through Home Dollars as well. So it's another resource that would go towards building long-term, sustainable, affordable housing as a critical resource and infrastructure piece for the city.
Great. Now, how likely do we feel that it is that the MID piece of the tax bill is reformed such that savings are reinvested into affordable housing?
Yeah, so that's everything that we do is difficult. I'm sure you guys know that too. It's always an uphill battle. The thing that gives me a lot of hope on this is that we've been talking to those moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats about the need to recapture this savings, and there is some interest among members of Congress to do that. The question is, can we have enough energy behind them, enough push on them, enough pressure to really get them to take that step? So we've talked to Susan Collins' office in Maine, and Murkowski's office in Alaska, Hatch's office from Utah. A lot of these folks who do care about affordable rental housing and see a renter's credit as a good possibility. But that's really why we need to have as many people advocating as possible so that we can really draw attention to this being a really important thing to do.
And now a follow-up to that question, if it does turn out to be the case that MID reform is not reinvested, that savings is not reinvested into affordable housing, do we advocate that MID stay in place until a later bill comes along that will recapture those savings?
So that's a really good question, and it's really hard to answer that right now because there's so many moving parts. I mentioned before that tomorrow we're likely to see the Senate bill, so we'll have a better sense of where the bill is headed. They wanted to introduce the House bill first so that they could see what people were responding to, what things were good about the bill, what things are bad about the bill, so that the Senate version could tweak that and address those concerns. We'll see how serious Republicans are about moving forward with MID reforms tomorrow. And I think that will play a big role in how we decide to move forward, but we just can't make that call just yet. We'll keep you guys in the loop, though.
And now, you mentioned throughout the presentation, Sarah, about how quickly leaders in Congress are wanting to move with this bill. If it does, and of course there's a piece of budget reconciliation enabling members of Congress to move even quicker by passing this on a simple majority vote. If the bill does pass without any significant reforms to the housing implications of the bill, what would housing organizations do beyond that point?
The question is, if oh, if the bill is enacted as is, what should housing organizations do moving forward? I think it's really important for all of us to be responding to this proposal as if it were the bill that's going to be enacted, even though we know changes will likely be coming. We really need to send a clear message that the bill as it currently stands is unacceptable and it's irresponsible, that it takes housing dollars and uses it to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy and for corporations, that it eliminates or undermines affordable housing tools that are used to in our communities to serve people's housing needs, and that it is increasing the debt at such a rate that it really puts our annual investments in affordable rental housing at risk. So I think it's really important that housing advocates play a role on this tax space, even though maybe we haven't done that before, maybe tax issues are outside of what you normally focus on. The impact on affordable housing is so severe with this tax proposal as it is. It's really important that everybody weigh in with their members of Congress on it.
So take action now, don't wait for that future point, and turn to us if you need help doing so.
Yeah, there's just so little time to get this done and so much momentum and pressure that if we're not advocating now, we're really missing the best opportunity to make an impact here.
Yes, so another question, kind of going in a slightly different direction. Sarah, do we have any thoughts, any intel on why no piece of the T. Barry Neal bill was included in last week's tax bill?
So I think part of it is because the T. Barry Neal bill had a fix or an improvement to the 4% tax credit, and it's hard to eliminate the 4% tax credit and then have a bill that would have made an improvement to it. So that's a little bit of mixed messaging that maybe Republicans didn't want to engage in. But I think also, I think it's, again, a starting point in their negotiations, and maybe they think that this gives them more leverage when ultimately they have to negotiate with their Senate counterparts. So I'm not quite sure. I know it seems very much like Congressman T. Barry, who's been such a strong supporter of the low-income housing tax credit, was pained in the committee markup about the impact on affordable rental housing in the bill. That's a really good question that I really just don't have a clear answer on, and we're trying to find as much information on as possible. Well, thank you so much for joining today's webinar. Again, if you need any resources or help when you're engaging your members of Congress, please feel free to reach out to us or check out the United for Homes website. If you have any questions, reach out, and thank you again.
Yeah, thank you all. If you do think of any other questions, you're welcome to reach anyone on our staff at any time. Again, look out in your email inboxes for a link to a recording of this presentation, plus slides from today and other resources that were linked and mentioned in the presentation. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great day.